What about people that don't believe you? You figure out, oh, this is like objectively what would be best for people. And you run into that wall of a very loud minority because that tends to happen a lot, especially around climate issues.
Not only in the States, by the way.
It's nice to know it's not just here. I think there's kind of two general approaches. There's a ton of behavioral literature that shows that the earlier that you can work at a population level of reaching somebody, generally the more open they're going to be to something. So, for example, early education models, where if you could get in at like an elementary age of teaching critical thinking skills, and how to problem solve. Like, I wouldn't even be talking about climate issues. I'd be like, here's your critical thinking tool set and your skill set, so that you can reason through and come to logical conclusions that are rational at the end of the day. That has been something that has consistently shown that it works. I'm currently working on a small documentary and like course with a group in Seattle that focuses on these sort of things. And part of the method is you actually have to bring in a lot of different topics. So you can have them try to critique things, from a pro climate versus a anti climate stance. You could do this with pro, con, whatever it is that you want to bring in there. But it's teaching them how to dissect and pull things apart will typically lead people to being able to rationalize and kind of figure out what is the best solution at the end of the day. So it's a lot of it's like really early work. I always feel like that's a little bit of a cop out of an answer sometimes, because what you're doing is you're just kind of shrugging your shoulders as somebody ages and is farther down the line in their thinking there. But unfortunately, the data does show like the earlier your intervention on things, typically the better your outcomes are going to be there. That holds not only in critical thinking, reasoning skills, that can come outcomes in education, where help people move up the SES social economic status in their lifetimes. It could lead to health outcomes. Like it's a robust, solid start with early intervention. The other side is your metaphors and examples that you use can have some really strong impacts. So this is how I've always looked at a solution for, you could use it in an early education kind of standpoint, but you could use it later on too, is people will play around with what metaphors tend to work for people with certain types of experience. So the metaphor that I'm going to use with somebody that is in a rural Nevada setting in the United States where I'm at is going to be different than one that I'm going to use in, say, Las Vegas, Nevada. The background, the experience, the where they're at, all of that can impact. Unfortunately, there's not like a robust bank where you can just go to and be like, okay, what metaphors seem to work better on certain topics, and all that's walked out. But over the last 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 now, our field's been trying to really figure out like what metaphors work, because they do fall apart across culture, across borders. Some of them will work in some places when you carry them over to another culture or population, but other places they completely fall apart. So I personally have a lot of fun with that. For example, we used to do some fundraising, and the fundraising was for people with intellectual disabilities. And a lot of conservative stances are that we shouldn't be donating to the situations where people are, quote, taking advantage of the system. That's a problem. But being able to help somebody get off of that system and become independent and obtain a job and be part of the workforce really resonated with them. So donations really came down to how did we speak to the donors based on their political beliefs or their political leanings to be able to raise that funding. Now, on the back end of that, you have to deliver on the outcomes. Like if I'm not getting people independent jobs, like they're going to see through that real quick. But you have to be also pretty careful in your wording there. So that's the two methods that really come to mind right now, Charlie.
I tend to test things based on sort of my perspective, because I think if I'm going to be showing a piece of work or trying to communicate something to an audience, like if I was in their shoes watching a piece of content for the first time, like what would kind of be my gut reaction? And one of those things is storytelling versus just talking about numbers and data. And I think that really touches on your use of metaphors. What have you seen in your work as far as the effectiveness of a story versus the effectiveness of just trying to explain literally something to someone.
All right, Charlie, story every time. And it pains me as a scientist to say this. um, the It has been so abundantly clear. I don't understand the psychological reasons here. Like, people tend to kind of lean on like, oh, evolutionarily, like we've always been telling stories and stories really resonate and like they transcend culture and like across generations. I just haven't spent time reading the literature to fully understand why single stories seem to do well. It's clear that they do. I'm very pragmatic, so it's kind of like what works, and I'm going to double down on what works because there's problems to solve here. So individual stories are definitely the way to go. That's what got me into really storytelling, and probably why I'm sitting here with you all is just realizing that if I want to influence something that is a societal level problem beyond that individual person, even though you can work with the individual person, if I want to do that, you need to be able to move people in ways that will impact things on a much broader scale. Climate change is a perfect example of this. No matter how many behavior analysts we would train up to go out, even if we set up funding streams to try to work on solving individual problems and people's consumption, how they interpret it, how they view it, et cetera, we will never be able to scale that treatment model, right? Like individual one-on-one working to ever do that. So for storytelling, for me, that was like this hack of, if I can do this right, I could get people to adopt one little perspective change and potentially even influence how they behave day to day with respect to that problem that we're trying to talk about. Actually, I picked this up. I learned this from a mother of a child with autism that wrote a book a while ago. They were talking about how the data and the methods of science are sufficient, but they're not necessary to get people to kind of act. Like, you need to figure out the methods and the ways in which we're going to influence behavior. But at that point, all you need to be able to do is, as quickly as you can, figure out a way to get people to move and act on that using that science. But they don't need to understand the science and how it's working. They don't need to understand the scope, the scale of the problem, etc. As long as you can get them acting in line with what the scientific literature says, then you've achieved your goal. And storytelling seems to be one of the most impactful ways to do that. There's a few other things that seem to matter too. While I'm on that, the storyteller needs to be relatable to the person that you're trying to reach. That is a very big part of it as well. The methods need to be at least as incentivized or more incentivized than alternative options. So this is a big thing for climate. We're trying to fix the incentive systems, right? Like choosing green options over not green options. This has been a thing they've been trying to do for a couple of decades, at least here in the United States. That's another aspect of it too. So is the person relatable? Is the science there? Is it working? Are there alternative methods that are going to be competing? And then can you package it in a way to where people listen really at the end of the day? So it can be different modalities, but storytelling is a big part of that.
One thing that you brought up that really resonated with me is the fact that the subject telling the story has to be relatable to the person listening to the story. And I wonder if that's a trust thing. And this is just purely like through my own observation of creating stuff and putting it out there and getting people's feedback, is that people are much more open to, or let me put it this way, they're much more vulnerable emotionally, and people tend to double down emotionally whenever there's like a contradiction on a worldview. They're much more open and vulnerable to change whenever there's a level of trust. To me, I feel like if the subject, or not necessarily the subject of the film, but the person presenting the subject is relatable, that person receiving it is much more open to be like, oh, okay, maybe they're onto something, versus going, oh, this person is ideologically different than me, I'm just going to ignore what they're saying. Just to kind of wrap that thought up, using stories in that method, at least for me, I think kind of what it does is it creates an image in my head, versus if somebody, even if it's the exact same person, is explaining data or charts or something like that, I'm not visually seeing that in my mind's eye. Even if I intellectually know what they're talking about or I agree with them, it's much more abstract.
Yeah, I think you're onto it there. The other aspect is like perspective taking around large numbers and stuff like that. Like I think those things are learned skill sets. Like you can show me data on prevalence rates and I can pretty quickly be like, oh, let's say that 1 in 50 people are experiencing this. Like I can pretty easily quickly look at in my local community with 500,000 people, like, oh my gosh, like this is, X amount of people that are struggling with this sort of problem. It just takes practice, I think, looking at those. And there's not a lot of places in society to kind of get that practice. So um, the data part will work for a group of people that are interested in data, but usually we're looking for ways to reach mass audience, and that's just kind of not the way to go.